Malays. Now, I was hoping to write here, but I was told that I can't write here. If I write here, would it? No. What do we have to do in order to be able to write here? Okay, Tom is not around. So I was hoping to use this, but I'm told that if we use this, now they've taken away, because I was going to make this a little interactive by writing some of these names, which some of you might actually encounter in your future studies, but some of you may have encountered already. How many of you do humanities and social sciences? Okay, so some of the names are going to be familiar to you, or you may have encountered them. Okay, so to reiterate, or so that we do not lose track, the second part of the talk is going to try and suggest a different way. And my suggestion of a different way of understanding the historical basis of the present underdevelopment Malays in Africa, the basis of my attempt, or the basis of that alternative historical explanation, is work by a Nigerian sociologist named Peter Eke. So there are two parts in the talk as I've outlined. Let us now then return to the first part, which is basically an unsympathetic retelling of the dominant explanatory or paradigmatic explanation of why is Africa underdeveloped, or of the Malays of development. It's not the marker. I think it's more than the marker. Even if the marker were to show, I think the board has to be illuminated for it to show. But it's fine if we can't. It's okay.
No, I don't think we illuminated. These are the only ones we would have. I can grab you the whiteboard if you want.
Okay, so let us then return to the first dominant paradigmatic explanation of why is the continent underdeveloped. And the second part, as I've said, we're going to try and profile an alternative way of understanding the historical basis of Africa's underdevelopment. In summary, this dominant paradigm, this explanatory narrative, in summary, basically, it points to colonialism as the reason or the source of Africa's underdevelopment. So in sum, basically, what this narrative says is that basically, in order to understand Africa's present underdevelopment Malays, we have to look to colonialism. Now, that on its own is helpful, but not so helpful. What in colonialism are we to look at? Colonialism itself, as we're going to soon see, may be something we assume its meaning is given, but it might not be. Its meaning, actually, I want to suggest, is in a state of flux. People understand colonialism in different ways. Many people today say, but colonialism ended in 1960. Why are you still harping on it? You know, people say colonialism continues today. You know, so colonialism itself, its meaning is not a given, but contested. But that's not our preoccupation. The point is that this first narrative, or this first explanation, basically says that it is colonialism that is responsible for Africa's underdevelopment. And the point we're making is that, well, that might be helpful, but what exactly in colonialism? And so it will help to be specific, to delineate explicitly what in colonialism is responsible for Africa's underdevelopment today. Now, within this dominant narrative, there is a camp of left-leaning scholars. And these left-leaning scholars often focus on the structural factors responsible for setting Africa on an underdevelopment path. So within this first dominant narrative, there's a camp within it. Or if you are more accustomed to liberal thinking, there are different viewpoints. You know, liberals put it nicely, say viewpoints, it's camps. You would learn later on that these are not just, you know, supine viewpoints that exist innocently. There's a contest, you know, amongst them. But so within this dominant narrative, there is a left-leaning camp or group of scholars who focus often, as I've said, on the structural factors responsible for setting Africa on an underdevelopment path. These left-leaning scholars were largely influenced by the Latin American dependency school. So out of this camp came out a distinct African radical political economy school. So the time is the 1960s and 70s. Africa has just gained its independence. It's obvious that it is, quote unquote, not developing. And so there's a need to explain why that is the case. These African radical political economy scholars, largely influenced by, you know, a school of thought that emanated out of Latin America called the dependency school, began to explain in structural terms how colonialism was responsible for this failure of development. So as I've said, largely influenced by the Latin American dependency school, the African radical political economy scholars, these were people like, again, these are names that you are likely to encounter. So I mention them because you are likely or you have encountered them in your studies. So amongst African scholars in this camp who were influenced by the dependency school were people like Siamira Amin. No.
Pink one works.
Is it? I'm not sure.
There was the pink one that she used, the orange one.
I think this thing has to be put on so that there's light from, so if you write, then it shows. If you get my point. Otherwise, like this, let's hope.
The pink one.
Is it? Which? No, it's purple.
No.
I'm colorblind. This.
Yeah.
Then maybe we should just ask for a board, a whiteboard. If you could run and ask her for a whiteboard, what did she call it?
Yeah.
Yeah, the standing flip chart. Whilst you try something, let me see. Okay. If we ask, maybe we should just ask for a flip chart. Then we can work with that. I was trying to see if I could get the, see this, if I write here.
We can just spell the name.
Let's try just, okay, I would have to spell the name. I think I can't. I thought I could pull that down. Okay. Can we use this? There's something you have to do so that I'm able to write here and then it projects.
Yeah.
Showing here, but hopefully it will show that.
Yeah.
Very good. Perseverance. Okay, so as I was saying, there is this dominant school, or rather this dominant explanatory paradigm, and within it, there is, okay, to go back up, I would encounter Peter Eke again, so I'll mention the name once again. So within this dominant paradigm, there are people who are left-leaning. And mainly these African scholars were influenced, as I said, by the Latin American school, which is called the dependency school, you know. And these African scholars included people like Samira Amin. Samira Amin was an Egyptian. Oh, no, it's just a matter of positioning. How does, oh, okay. This thing doesn't like me. Samira Amin was an Egyptian. Oh, no. Samira Amin was an Egyptian scholar, but there were many others. I'm not going to write or to mention all of them. There was Claude Ake, who's a Nigerian political economist or a Nigerian economist. But there was also Walter Rodney. Walter Rodney is famous, traded his obscurity for the book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Now, Walter Rodney originally was from Guyana, not from the continent, but he spent his academic life in East Africa as part of this radical African political economy school. So there were many other scholars, you know, within this school of thought who belong to, as I've said, the radical political economy school. And basically, their argument was simply that it was precisely at the moment of the encounter. It was at the moment when Africa encountered the West that it began to de-develop. And so their argument was that Africa's encounter with the West is precisely what was responsible for Africa's underdevelopment. How? Samira Amin wrote a PhD thesis, 1957, that would later be published into a book. And indeed, he does something very interesting. He basically calculates how much of African wealth ends up in Europe through different ways of extraction, you know, and how that actually goes to feed what you call soft life in Europe. To be more precise, basically what Samira Amin does is to calculate exactly the amount of wealth that gets out of the continent and what it enables when it gets to Europe. Basically, what it enables is that it makes luxury goods easily available, you know, in Europe. So it is this wealth, he traces how this wealth, you know, from the continent goes to, you know, fund Western luxurious lifestyles. But this was also, in a sense, what Walter Rodney was concerned with in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. So Walter Rodney wrote a book titled How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which became a seminal text within African radical political economy. It's a text that continues to define that tradition. And for those of you who study the social sciences, I'm sure you will encounter the book somewhere in your studies. Now, it will perhaps help to be more specific in how Europe is thought by these scholars to have underdeveloped Africa. So to start with, they argue that Europe, and by Europe, they mean the West, basically, not just Europe, continental Europe, including this country. So basically, Europe is a euphemism for the West. So basically, their argument is that Europe or the West integrated Africa into the international economic system, basically as a provider of primary commodities and as an importer of finished industrial goods, or as an importer of value-added products. So basically, what the West does, according to this radical African political economy school, is to integrate Africa into an international economic system and allocates to Africa a role basically as a supplier of primary commodities. And then Africa ends up importing out of Europe what are finished products or industrial goods. Now, in fact, in the book, How Europe Underdeveloped Europe, Walter Rodney, states this euphemistically when he says that basically we were, as the continent, integrated into the international economic system as hewers of wood and drawers of water. We basically, our responsibility in the assignation of responsibilities or labor in the international economic system, basically Africa was assigned a role as a provider of primary commodities. Now, if you stretch, as some other people have done, if you stretch that argument to a period prior to colonialism, we provided to Europe physical labor through slavery. And so there is a continuity in how Africa has been integrated into the international economic system. First, we provided labor through slaves, and later on, post the era of slavery, when it was no longer possible to commoditize human beings, we provided primary commodities to Europe. So that is the first specific way in which these scholars think of how Europe underdeveloped Africa. It is that it assigned to us a role in the international economic system where we were providers basically of primary goods, and then in the process were the importers of finished products. The second point that these scholars direct us to is that all African economies, or most African economies, but it is 90% or 95% of them, were actually engineered to become monocultural economies. You know what are monocultural economies? There are no economists in this room. Anyone studies economics here? Monocultural economies are basically economies that depend on one primary commodity for a large part of their GDP income. It's not that they don't have other contributors to their GDP, but if you have an economy, for instance, where, take South Africa in times past, where gold accounted, for instance, for 80% of the GDP, or let's say mining accounted for 80% of GDP, that would be a monocultural economy. So basically, African economies were engineered to become monocultural economies. Those of us who went to school in times past learned of African countries in association with their primary commodity or in association with the commodity they were known for. We learned of Ghana, cocoa, Ivory Coast, cocoa, Kenya, different, commodities. Can I park your question for the end, or is it?
It's sort of, it has to do with this. I served in Malawi, and for years and years and years, of course, the West convinced Banda to encourage tobacco. And so they pulled out, their food crops and they planted tobacco. And then when it came down to marketing, unless you had a certain tonnage, the marketing board wouldn't buy it. And you couldn't just sell it in Malawi. It had to be exported. So these farmers were sort of tricked into growing this crop that the government would not buy it, even though they assured them that they would. They didn't say anything about forming co-ops or anything like that. People just sort of had to learn on their own. This is back in the 60s,
Yeah.
And
So can I?
This fell apart.
Yeah. So that's why I say these economies were engineered into becoming monocultural economies. It was not automatic. It was not as though this was basically the only commodity that these societies could produce. But the West deliberately, depending on who colonized you and what they wanted, basically they would turn that country into a producer of a commodity that was needed back in the West. For those of you who study anthropology, I would highly recommend a text by Sidney Mintz, Sweetness and Power. Sidney Mintz. The book is titled Sweetness and Power. What is the significance of the book? It is that Sidney Mintz traces how when Europe discovered the sweet pilot, basically turned all its colonies into sugarcane plantations. It was not a natural development that you ended up with the Caribbean becoming a sugarcane plantation. Europe for a long time drank coffee without sugar. But it was at the moment when it discovered the sweet pilot that it then decided that cotton was no longer in fashion and turned the Caribbean into a sugarcane plantation. Many other African countries, especially in Southern Africa, including South Africa, the country I come from, if you travel the country today, a large part of the agricultural land in South Africa is sugarcane plantation. This was made in order to serve Europe's, sweet pilot. So that's why I think the book by Sidney Mintz is significant, Sweetness and Power, because it shows how power, or rather how the sweet pilot would drive power into turning countries into sugarcane plantations. But it was not only limited to sugarcane. Virtually every colony was made in Africa to produce that particular commodity that was in the interest of the mother country or the country that was colonizing that country. In other situations, of course, it was commodities that were generally, in service of Western life in general. So this is the second point, specific point that the radical African political economy scholars point to as the reason for Africa's present underdevelopment malaise. One, they said, we were integrated into the international economic system as providers of primary commodities and importers of finished products or value-added products. Two, we were deliberately, or rather African economies were deliberately engineered into becoming monocultural economies. Three, prices of these primary commodities out of these monocultural economies, prices were set in the West. So even when these colonies had been engineered into becoming monocultural, producing either sugarcane or sugar, or producing, cocoa or whatever else, the prices were not set by these countries. They did not have control over the prices. The prices were set in the West. In fact, in the language more familiar to students of economics, you would say these African countries were price takers. Now, in today's economics, in mainstream economies, in today's mainstream economics, when you say a country is a price taker or an economy is a price taker, it sounds like, a law of economics. It's not. Countries are made to be price takers through power and violence. And in a moment, you are going to see how. South Africa today produces or is the third largest producer of platinum in the world. So you see these cars that you see outside here, you know, with nice heating and cooling systems. The element needed for that comes from, you know, platinum, and we're the third largest producer of platinum in the world. But the price for it is not set in South Africa. The price for it is set in what you call the international market. Now, the inclusion and exclusion in that international market where the price is set is not an economic decision, it's a political decision. In a moment, again, if that's not clear, you would see how countries are made into price takers. So, these economies were turned into monocultural economies, but they were also made price takers. Now, read together, all of these 3 points that I've made about how the West underdeveloped Africa, what they together do or show us is how African economies were rendered susceptible to external vagaries or, you know, to external shocks. Now, this again sounds like, well, a usual economic phrase, economies are susceptible to external shocks. No. What this meant is that if you turned a country like Swaziland, for instance, into a sugarcane plantation, at a time when the West discovered, just like it had discovered the sweet pilot, by the time a few decades down the line, or maybe a century down the line, it discovers that actually sugar kills, it causes diabetes. Let's abandon it and let's use honey or use sweeteners. What happens to Swaziland? It has an economy that is dysfunctional. It suddenly is left because the West does not then go to Swaziland and say, we may actually be abandoning sugar. Let's think together about what other commodity may you move into. Simply changes it, abandons it, midway the crops are there, and for the whole, you know, economic season, what do you call them? Economic reporting terms, financial year. For the whole financial year, the country has nothing to report because Europe suddenly discovered that sugar kills, and therefore it's no longer going to use sugar, it's going to depend on honey or sweeteners. If that is not clear enough, South Africa, again, the country I come from, was also turned into a sugarcane plantation. And so we were basically one of the world's largest sugar producers. In the region of about 50% of the world's sugar came from South Africa. Now, suddenly, in the recent past, the West has discovered an obsession for clean energy. And what did it do? It went again to South Africa and converted those sugarcane plantations into plantations for what is called the macadamia nuts. Apparently, the macadamia nuts produce some kind of oil, you know, that is going to be a substitute for dirty fossil fuel. Now, I'm giving you this example in order to illustrate how economies then become susceptible to external shocks and external vagaries. They no longer have control over the trajectory of the development of their economy. That is basically dictated to them from outside. And so, when you have a whole continent whose economies are susceptible to those kinds of shocks, this is why you have these fluctuations that at times appear abnormal, because suddenly one primary commodity that sustained a particular economy is no longer favored in the international market, and the whole economy, you know, collapses. So when we say that these economies were basically rendered susceptible to external shocks or external vagaries, the point is not just a lame point. It is that some economies literally collapse as a result of those transitions because they have nothing else to fall back on. And this is how in most instances, when that shock, external shock happens, as it happened in 1973 to most African countries that were oil producing when the price of oil basically dipped, it is that countries end up in a debt trap because then they no longer have their GDP lost its mainspring, income earner. And so what do? They have to go and borrow. But of course, when mainstream economists tell you, it says that these economies become indebted because they misspend money and all of that. In often cases, the first cycle of indebtedness, because once you get into it, you can't get out. The first cycle of indebtedness comes as a result. If you study African economies, the first cycle of indebtedness comes as a result of this susceptibility to external shocks. And these external shocks come in different ways, as we've tried to demonstrate. Fourthly, as these radical African political economy scholars illustrate, the fourth point that explains how Europe underdeveloped Africa is that there was an observable, deliberate disjuncture created between what Africa produces and what Africa consumes. As such, because of that engineering of African economies to becoming monocultural, you ended up with a situation where African economies, or when African countries produce what they do not consume and consume what they do not produce. The result of that engineering of African economies into monocultural economies is that that engineering process is not informed by what are the needs of the African countries. That engineering is informed by the needs of Western countries. The result, the end product of that engineering process is that Africa consumes what it does not produce and produce what it does not consume. When you live here, ask any Ghanaian person you know, what is the fraction of Ghanaian people who are obsessed with coffee? Next to nothing. But coffee is the mainstay. Well, recently cold has become the mainstay, but for a long time, coffee was the mainstay of the Ghanaian economy. So Ghanaians were producing what they do not consume, basically. So you have productive land in Ghana that is producing what people do not consume. It's the story across the continent. It's not just in Ghana. Similarly, in Ivory Coast, when you meet someone from Ivory Coast, ask them what's the fraction of the Ivorian population that is obsessed with coffee. So basically, the end result is that you have African countries that produce what they do not consume and consume what they do not produce. But it did not end there. It went further than that in the fact that for countries in Southern Africa, for most countries in Southern Africa, and if you want to think best about what I'm going to talk about, think about this country and South Africa. America and South Africa share one typical characteristic. It is that they are atypical settler colonies, where you have external people coming to occupy the country or white colonizers who basically come to settle in a country and make it their home, such that even at the moment of independence, they do not leave. They remain in the country. In many other countries, they leave. So, in order to understand that, there are different kinds of colonialism. In the continent, colonialism took two forms. There was settler colonies, and there was what we call colonies of domination. Basically, settler colonies, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Angola, Mozambique, Namibia, parts of East Africa, Tanzania and Kenya, were basically settler colonies, which is to say that the colonizers did not only dominate those countries politically and economically, but they turned them into their own homes, such that at independence they did not leave. On the other hand, colonies of domination mostly found in West Africa and into Central Africa. These were colonies where the colonizers basically were content to send a few colonial administrators, and at independence, these colonial administrators left. So Nigeria, Togo, Ghana, basically the whole of West Africa. These were colonies of domination. Now, why is this differentiation important? It is that if you look closely at the food culture of settler colonies, one of the ways, in fact, in which you know whether a country is a settler colony, look at the food culture. One of the things that Europeans did was to change the food culture in settler colonies, such that if you get to South Africa, food is more or less like in Europe or here. So there's nothing really peculiar. You would still find those few things that are peculiarly South African, but by and large, you can walk into any South African restaurant and order exactly what you would order here or what you would order in Europe. Because the food culture, they tend or transformed the food culture in those countries such that that problem of a disjuncture between producing what you do not consume and consuming what you do not produce becomes even more pronounced in colonies of settlement. And so there was a slight streak in that fact. It is that in transforming the food cultures of these countries, the West created an advantage for itself because it literally created a market for itself, for its own commodities. So today, if you go to any settler colony, people think that it is normal to wake up, your breakfast must include all bran flakes or, cornflakes and all of that. It is this country that benefits because it's the largest producer of wheat. And so everyone who wakes up to, Kellogg cornflakes or all bran flakes is basically supporting this economy. As people who live in West Africa, they are born until they die, they don't wake up with all bran flakes. There's nothing wrong. Nothing happens to people who do not wake up with English breakfast. But when you transform the food culture of these societies, you do not only create a disjuncture between what they produce and what they consume, but you also create a dependency. And so these countries become dependent, on those countries that produce the kind of food that they come to eat. So we eat processed food now, canned food, and of course, who benefits? It is those who produce canned food and processed food. So that was the first camp in this first dominant narrative. There was a second camp, or a second viewpoint, if you wish, that was less focused on the material and structural explanation. Now, this second viewpoint, as I've said, less focused on material or economic explanation, was focused more on sociocultural and political factors. At times, you got a sense that they were focused on behavioral factors, as to why Africa was underdeveloped. So for these scholars who were focused on sociocultural and political factors, post-colonial Africa was inevitably bound for underdevelopment because, one, the colonial state and the post-colonial state that followed it both suffered from what they called a crisis of legitimacy. So you would see that in this second camp, there is a shift away from the economic and material explanations towards more sociocultural and political explanation. The first explanation is that the colonial state lacked legitimacy, obviously. So their argument is that even the post-colonial state that took over from the colonial state equally lacked legitimacy. And so Africa was well on a path to underdevelopment because the state lacked legitimacy. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the history of the continent, may say that, well, the first few years of independence, there were popular regimes in the continent. Nyerere, Kwame Nkrumah, and several others. That euphoria of independence did not last long because the expectations, because of what was called the unfulfilled expectations of independence. That euphoria was very short-lived. There's nowhere where it lasted more than 10 years. Quickly, the cracks began to appear in those popular regimes, in their popularity. And so they began to lose legitimacy, largely because of the unfulfilled expectations of independence. So the first explanation for those who focus on social, cultural, and political factors is the fact that the post-colonial state lacked legitimacy. And so it could not carry forth the necessary transformation of society that would lead to development. The second explanation they offer is that because of indirect rule, now indirect rule was a form of rule much preferred by the British. Briefly, indirect rule was simply this. We said there were colonies of domination and there were colonies of settlement. And in colonies of domination, there were very few colonial administrators. Now, how, for instance, were 100 to 200 colonial administrators going to govern Nigeria with such a large population and a large, landmass? They turned to what was called indirect rule. The British set and designed what was called indirect rule. What was indirect rule? Basically, create ethnic groups everywhere, even where they did not exist, create ethnic groups, and then impose a chief on the people or a traditional form of authority. So many of the people who today tell you that the most distinct form of rule in Africa is traditional authority, it's absolute nonsense. Many of those things were created by colonialism. Many societies did not have, traditional systems of rule. But indirect rule needed a system because you did not have enough European manpower. And so what do? You balkanize the country into ethnic enclaves, and then you impose traditional rulers. In fact, at some point, they were so obvious. Where traditional rulers did not exist, they appointed what was called warrant chiefs. So many of the chieftaincies you hear of today basically began as warrant chiefs. And because, of course, the appellation warrant was very obvious, you were warranted by the colonialists, it fell away after some time, and everyone became a chief, as if being a chief is a traditional, position. But the point I'm making is that because of indirect rule, many African countries oftentimes suffered what was called the problem, or the post-colonial African state suffered or was defined by what was called contested citizenship. Now, what is contested citizenship? It is that, as I've said, because of indirect rule, you had the country balkanized into different ethnic groups. Now, contested citizenship was basically a contestation between or among these recently created ethnic groups, each jostling with the other over the state resources. So today in Kenya, this began as the problem of Majimboism or regionalism. So there were people who agitated that Kenya had to be at independence, had to be organized along regional lines such that one ethnic group would have, each ethnic group rather, would have its own region and will control the resources of that region. So the problem of contested citizenship often manifested itself or would break out on the surface as a problem of ethnic or regional or religious conflict. So what do you today hear of as a problem of ethnic conflict in the continent? Is basically a manifestation of what we've just called contested citizenship. In fact, the more recent example of it would be Ethiopia, the war that has raged in Ethiopia in the recent past. It is because when you have indirect rule, it first creates ethnic identities, and people come to think of these identities as natural, as actually being definitive of who they are, whereas some of these identities are as recent as colonial rule. But also these ethnic identities come to determine who dominates the state, who has access to the resources. And so under indirect rule, there were often ethnic groups that were treated preferentially by the colonizers. In Nigeria, for instance, the supposition by the Yorubas and the Igbos is that the Hausas or the Northerners were actually preferred by the colonial administrators. And often that would lead to animosity in the post-colonial period. So, the second, as I've said, the second explanation from those who focus less on material explanations is that because of indirect rule, the post-colonial state was defined by the problem of contested citizenship. Now, why do I harp on this problem of contested citizenship? It is because oftentimes you would hear when people talk about the situation of the continent, they will tell you that the problem is that people in Africa have an ethnic consciousness, or there are too many ethnic wars, as if these things are innate or biological when they were actually created. But more than that, it is that often, if you think a little harder about this kind of conflict that often breaks out into ethnic civil wars or religious civil wars or regional civil wars, there is a pattern. For those who are comparativist in their thinking, think about the following countries: Sudan, Zimbabwe, India, Nigeria. I always make a mistake between Panama and Grenada. Which one was a British colony? Between the two. Which other country? But all of these countries I've mentioned, whether it is Nigeria, India, Zimbabwe, they were all former British colonies. And look at their political history. Immediately after independence, civil war breaks out. Again, when you look from the outside, you say there's too much war in the continent. There is a pattern. The pattern is that these countries were basically the laboratories of British indirect rule, where you manufactured ethnic groups and you pitted them against each other in contestation. And indeed, when colonialism ends, these countries descend into a civil war. Again, for other pedestrian explanations, often the explanation is that, oh, there's too much war in Africa, as if, it is in the nature of Africans, to be conflictual. But the point, so that it's not lost, it is that the colonial state and the post-colonial state that takes over from it is defined by contested citizenship. And this contested citizenship often breaks out on the surface as ethnic contestation or regional war or religious contestation. The third explanation from this camp that does not focus on economic or material explanation, the third explanation they proffer, and this explanation is often favored by anthropologists, it is that Africa, they say, lack the requisite sociocultural conditions necessary for development. It is that Africa lacks the necessary sociocultural requisites or conditions for development. Now, what are these? Sometimes you get a sense that these sociocultural, conditions that are requisite for development, they are also behavioral, because often people point to the behavior of Africans as an explanation. But let us follow them as they outline these sociocultural conditions of development that are supposedly lacking in the continent. So they say that in the continent in Africa, rather than impersonality or merit or logic, It is said that African societies are governed by what is called an economy of affection. People make decisions on the basis not of merit, not on the basis of logic, not on the basis, of impersonality, but there is an economy of affection. People tend to make decisions on the basis of, emotions of different kinds, whether it's ethnic, whether it's familial, whether it is, any other kind. So they say the problem why these societies are not developed is because there is this culture that is anti or that is antithetical to merit, that is antithetical, to impersonality, that is antithetical, to making decisions on the basis of facts, so to say. But people make decisions on the basis of what is called the economy of affection. Two, again, they are still outlining these lacking requisite sociocultural conditions. Two, African societies, it is said, lack what is called structural differentiation. Instead, they are diffused. Their structures are diffused. Basically, for those who study sociology, I'm sure you would have encountered a whole part of sociology that says that as societies develop, move from being primitive societies to being modern societies, one of the defining features of that movement is that they become structurally differentiated. That's where structural functionalism comes from, if you've ever heard of structural functionalism. The logic is simple. The logic of structural differentiation and structural functionalism is simple. One structure, one function. So they say as societies become developed and specialized, you must not have one structure performing many functions. Each structure must perform one function. And that's the sign of a developed society. So, there is more to say about this dominant paradigmatic explanation, but because of time, I think we have outlined its features enough for people to get a sense of what have been the dominant explanation or explanations of why Africa is underdeveloped today. Many of the commonsensical explanations you hear today largely emanate out of this dominant, paradigmatic explanation. Now that we have outlined this paradigmatic explanation, perhaps I was not as unsympathetic as I wanted to be or as I had promised to be to these explanations. But be that as it may, just in case you have not seen what is wrong with both of these paradigmatic explanations, both the material and the sociocultural explanation, it is that both of them assume that once the identified problems bequeathed by colonialism or that follow logically from colonialism, once these problems that they all identify have been attended to, they assume that the problem of development would invariably have been attended to. So you get a sense that according to these two paradigmatic viewpoints, once you attend to the list of problems they identify, then you would have attended to the problem of development. So if you then attended to Africa's, asymmetrical integration into the international economic system, and Africa was able to negotiate prices for its commodities, the supposition is that then you would have attended to the problem of development. Of course, not just the asymmetrical integration, but all of the things that the radical political economy school lists as the problem. Now, there's something wrong in that logic, because basically it doesn't tell us what development is. It just assumes that once you attend to these problems, then you would have attained development. What is development? It does not tell us. But also, more fundamentally at the level of thought, it assumes that, and the latter one focusing on sociocultural explanations has been taken over largely in the West. And so, in these parts, those elements that, we identified with the second viewpoint are largely favored in the West. And so the supposition is that once you attend to those things, the effects of colonialism would also have long, or rather would become a thing of the past. So that is what is wrong with both of these paradigms. It is that they assume that once you attend to the problem of colonialism and the elements identified, then you would have attended to the problem of development. In a sense, then, what these two explanations do is to assume that colonialism and its aftermath or its vestiges are things that can be set aside or transcended if conscientiously worked at. Now, I want to suggest to you that this supposition that colonialism is something that can be set aside with its after effects is as a result of an erroneous understanding of colonialism. In the remaining few minutes, and I'll shut up, what I'm going to do is to outline an alternative understanding of colonialism to you that these scholars miss. And that understanding of colonialism, you would see how different it is because it lays the foundation for the third lecture where we will provide an answer as to how to escape the problem of underdevelopment. This alternative view of colonialism, this alternative exposition that I'm going to outline to you, is basically drawn from Peter Eke's inaugural address that he delivered at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria in 1980. It's titled Colonialism and Social Structure. Highly recommend. It's titled Colonialism and Social Structure. It was delivered in Nigeria in 1980 as an inaugural lecture. And it tries to explain what colonialism is. And I want to suggest that if we begin understanding colonialism from Peter Eke's exposition, we may be better placed than we are with the two paradigmatic explanations. And you would see why I think that Peter Eke's exposition of colonialism is superior. Superior as it is, it also falls short. And that's where we're going to take off in order to provide, ultimately what is our contribution to this discourse. So Peter Eke, as I said, is a Nigerian sociologist who gave an inaugural lecture at Ibadan University in Nigeria in 1980 titled Colonialism and Social Structure. What is his main thesis? His main thesis is that colonialism was not a temporary affliction with a start and an end date. It's not something whose after effects could be easily undone in a programmatic manner. So Peter Eke's main contention is that colonialism was not a temporary affliction with a start and an end date. Now, if you think about the two paradigmatic explanations we were working with, you get a sense that colonialism is something they define specifically as an event that has a start and an end date. And its after effects you can reverse. Now, they work with an assumption that colonialism, and it is true in a sense, effective colonialism began in 1884, 1885, because that's when the Berlin Conference set. Now, the Berlin Conference basically was the conference of European powers where they set and decided and drew the map of Africa that we use today. Where they set and decided that Nigeria is a British colony, Kenya is a British colony, Egypt is a British colony, and they agreed and came out of there with a map. It was convened in Germany, in Berlin. So this is how you ended up with French territories, with German territories, English territories, and Lusophone territories, Spanish and Portuguese colonies. 1960 is the year when most, not all, but when many African countries gained independence. So if effective colonization began in 1884, 1885, 1960 marks its end. If you accept 1884, 1885, what started in 1884, 1885 ended in 1960. Because many African countries gained their independence. In fact, you know, half the continent gained its independence in 1960. Ghana had become independent, of course, 3 years earlier in 1957. And there were a few countries that had never been colonized. But many African countries became independent in 1960. And so, Peter Eke's point is that if you then use what is called historiography, historiography is a method Historiography is a method of studying history using dates and events. Now, Peter Eke says, if you use historiography to understand colonialism, you are going to miss its essence. Rather, colonialism was not an event with a start date and an end date. So if colonialism was not an event or an episode, what was it? So this is where Peter Eke says, it is much better to think about colonialism as an epoch rather than an episode. So as something that has contrary to an event or an episode, of course, you watch episodes on TV every time. So an episode, of course, has a start and an end. Peter Eke says colonialism was not an episode. It was an epoch. And what is an epoch? Basically, Peter Eke says that it is best to understand colonialism as an epochal movement. And he says that epochal movements basically are best understood as social movements whose supra-individual effects far outlive the time and space of their occurrence. Basically, epochal movements are social movements whose supra-individual effects far outlive the time and space of their occurrence, which is to say, epochal movements are those social movements that continue to linger on even long after their end date. So they don't have an end date in a sense because they linger on even after they supposedly have stopped. And he says, perhaps it will help if we understood colonialism alongside other epochal movements. And he gives us examples of these other epochal movements. He says that the French Revolution was another epochal movement. He says the Industrial Revolution was another epochal movement. Now, what is common to all of these epochal movements, whether it is the Industrial Revolution, the French Revolution, or colonialism? It is that epochal movements are totalizing in a sense that they do not give one an option to opt in or opt out. They are totalizing. So we live here today, we never participated in the Industrial Revolution, but our lives are those of industrial people, isn't it? We don't have an option to opt out. Whether we like it or not, we are defined by what came out of the Industrial Revolution. Or if you wish, we were not part of the French Revolution. But today, we think of democracy as a morally desirable form of government. We think of democracy in the sense in which it came to be defined by the French Revolution as liberty, equality, and fraternity. But we were not there. Or we can't extricate ourselves out of it. In fact, for those of us who come from outside of the West, the misfortune is that if you try to define yourself out of democracy, there is a country called America that is waiting to attack you. So, epochal movements do not allow people to opt in or opt out. They are totalizing. That's one feature. Colonialism is exactly the same thing, he says, because it is like the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution. The second feature of epochal movements is that they are like tidal waves. Wherever they have been, nothing remains the same. They are like tidal waves. You know, when a wave has been over the sand, nothing remains the same there. In what sense? He says that post the Industrial Revolution, nothing remained as it had been prior to the Industrial Revolution. But let's look closer to colonialism. His point is that prior to colonial, or rather, nothing in the continent after colonialism remained as it had been prior to colonialism. So when I make this example, or when I make this point to my students in Cape Town, they say, but you know, the Benin sculptures and you know, the artworks that existed prior to colonialism, they still exist today. I tell them that nothing remains the same when colonialism has happened, because precisely those same artworks have now been integrated into a circuit of international artworks as commodities. They were not commodities prior to colonialism. People sculpted to gift other people, or people sculpted for a particular occasion. People did not sculpt for the museums. People did not sculpt for tourists who would come and buy. People sculpted for, so the object itself acquired a new meaning as a result of colonialism. So nothing. Try a mental exercise and tell me if there is anything that you think remains as it had been prior to colonialism in the continent that is definitive of an autochthonous, you know, or a virgin Africa that is immune of any foreign intrusion. There's nothing that remains as it had been. If you think of any, you know, tell me or indicate. So the point about social movements of epochal dimensions is that once they have occurred, they transform the process of meaning making. We begin to think about things differently. So the object might remain as it had been, but its meaning differs, or it now circulates in a different circuit of meaning. So precisely those artifacts, as I said, they did not know that they would end up in museums. They were not sculpted for museums. They did not know that there were things to be displayed in international art festivals. But suddenly they become sought after as the most prized commodities. So they've entered the commodity market, the commodity economy where everything has a price, whereas previously they did not have that meaning. So all epochal movements basically are like tidal waves. Nothing remains the same as it had been once colonialism had happened. That is why people talk, when you must be wary when people talk about identities, pre-colonial African identities. We were this prior to colonialism. There's no such. Colonialism transformed everything. You know, there's nothing that remains as it had been. The third feature of epochs, we said they are totalizing. They don't allow people to opt in and opt out. Two, they're like tidal waves. Once they have occurred, they completely transform meaning. Three, all epochal movements integrate societies that they affect into a hierarchical world system. So epochs create a hierarchy. Epochal movements create a hierarchy. So the Industrial Revolution created a hierarchy of industrialized and non-industrialized society. The French Revolution created a hierarchy of morally superior countries that are democratic and undemocratic countries, not only undemocratic, but somewhat lacking a moral, ethic. Colonialism did exactly the same thing. It integrated countries into a hierarchical system of colonized and non-colonized societies. Now, here is where I think Peter Eke's useful analysis of colonialism fails. Or maybe it does not fail, but reaches its limit. One, Peter Eke says that it was the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution that are other two typical social movements comparable to colonialism. I suspect that for someone who was writing from Africa in the continent, teaching at Ibadan University, but also writing about a certain era of the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution, he ought to have known that there were two other social movements occurring exactly around the same time, or slightly earlier. One was the coming of modern racism. Racism as a social movement was an epochal movement that integrated the world into a hierarchical system. You were integrated into it either as Caucasoid, Mongoloid, or Negroid. You had no option. Until today, you have no option. Never mind that, modernity tries to fool us and say you can choose your race. The world encounters you in a certain way, decides for you, But let's not get into sidetrack. The point is that what Eke misses is that there were two other important social movements occurring around the time of the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution. And why are these important? They're important because he is trying to make sense of colonialism and its effects. So I'm going to suggest in the subsequent lectures that you can't make sense of colonialism outside of these two other social movements that he misses, which is the coming of modern racism to slavery. These were the other social movements that did exactly the same thing that the other social movements he identifies did. Today, you might not have been a slave, or we might not have been enslaved, but our existence is marked by slavery in a way. Two, we don't opt to be racialized, but that racial hierarchy is a hierarchy we can't, escape. So I'm going to end at this point by saying that now that we have an understanding of colonialism, a slightly different understanding of colonialism from colonialism, which is basically an episode with a start and an end date, where we think of colonialism as an epochal movement. I want you to take this thought experiment with you. What would it mean to think about colonialism in the same way as we think about the Industrial Revolution? Which would then mean that to get out of the malaise of colonialism imposes exactly the same task as getting out of the Industrial Revolution. Does that parallel make sense? The parallel I'm trying to draw is that for the first paradigmatic explanation, colonialism starts in 1884, 85, and ends in 1960, and it has its after effects. If you work hard, you might be able to undo those after effects. That's thinking about colonialism as an episode. Peter Eke says no. Colonialism was an epoch, not an episode, which is to say, you have to think about colonialism in the same way as you think about the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution happened in Britain in the 16th century, but there's no part of the world that has not been touched by the effects of the Industrial Revolution. But also, we can't get out. Today, centuries after, we can't get out of the Industrial Revolution. Remember, Peter Eke says, Epochal movements are supra-individual effects, have supra-individual effects, which far outlive the time and space of their occurrence. A social movement might happen on this table, but its effect far outlive the time and space of its occurrence. So it might occur in Africa, colonialism might occur only in Africa, but its effects far outlive the time and space of its occurrence. So to think of it as limited by a beginning and an end, according to Peter Eke, is very wrong. Now, today, other people claim that we're in the post-industrial age. Let's grant them the point. I don't think they are correct, but let's grant them the point. Still, the era we are in is still defined by the industrial age because we are post what? The industrial age. It means that you can't think of the present outside of the industrial age. Even though you say you are post the industrial age, your time horizon is still determined by the industrial period. Does that make sense? So the parallel then is, what would it take to get out of the effects of the Industrial Revolution? So if you thought about colonialism as being similar to the Industrial Revolution, the same effort is required to get out of the effects of colonialism because the two are comparable as epochal movements. Does that make sense? That's where we're going to take off in the second lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lushaba, for the wonderful lecture. And now we'll do a Q&A as people maybe get a break, but well, they get a break and come back, but we'll do a short Q&A. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can, but we only have maybe a couple minutes left. But yeah, I welcome the space of forum for question. Yes.
I have a question. Maybe this might be a misframing of my understanding of the Industrial Revolution versus like my lived experience through colonialism as someone that lived in Africa, a country like Rwanda that was colonized.
Which country?
Rwanda.
Rwanda.
With those two things, because Industrial Revolution, yes, I understand the part of like both of them are epochs, but Industrial Revolution created some of like the effects that up to now are not seen as like limiting effects. They're like moving forward effects, as opposed to like colonialism, where it's like a bottleneck in which like has slowed some communities down. So I'm finding it hard to draw the parallels between those two. And may you please clarify how one can draw parallels between those two, other than like the lasting impacts that they both had?
So I get what you're trying to drive at, but there is a wrong supposition that industrial age represents a forward movement. So let's think about the transformation in the food culture that the Industrial Revolution brought. Many of the diseases we live with today are a product of the industrial age. So you may think of the industrial age as having been positive. For people who live in the continent, in Africa, in fact, 90% of the diseases did not exist. Hypertension, blood pressure, diabetes, and all of those things. So let's not assume that the Industrial Revolution was all positive. But let's attend to what we are trying to say, which is, do they all represent a movement in the same direction? Whether it's colonialism or the Industrial Revolution or the French Revolution. I suppose Peter Eke's point is not about whether the effects are positive or negative. It is that the effects continue to linger on beyond the time and space of the occurrence. And because deciding whether, the developments are positive or negative would require a different, a different method. But I doubt if there isn't a way in which the industrial age and even the concept of democracy, as people who come from, Islamic countries, the concept, how detrimental the concept of democracy has been, to their societies. So I don't think that it would be possible to just think about the industrial age as having been solely positive. But the point is that for Peter Eke, the concern was not whether the movement is towards the positive or towards the negative. It is that the effects, whether negative or positive, are felt beyond the space and beyond the time of the event, which makes it an epoch.
Thank you for the great talk. Like I think when you summarize it, it's like we are screwed, but we are screwed by colonialism. That goes without saying, and the impact continues. But what can we do? And how do you account for African agency in your analysis? What is it that we can do? Like, what is it that our leaders can do? What is it that our scholars, intellectuals can do? What is it that this generation can do?
So I do have ideas about what is the possible way out of this bad picture we've painted. There are two preliminary things that need to happen first before we profile. Because see, there is a blackmail that as Africans we live with. It is the blackmail that Black people also live with. It is that when we complain about what we don't like, it is that, okay, what is the solution? Understanding what we don't like itself is a great step towards the solution. We must first understand the problem itself in its complexity. So when we spend time understanding the problem, it is so that when we proffer solutions, we don't come with solutions that do not match the problem. We don't want to come with a football team, whereas the problem is a rugby team. We're going to encounter a rugby team. There must be, synchrony in the arms we bring. Because the part of why we are where we are at, it is because we've always been rushed. Then the West would come and say, tell us what would lead to Africa developing. And then you assemble these people called academics, in a room, over 2 days, they produce a plan to resolve a problem that was created over centuries. What that leads to is that we rush into resolving the problem at an empirical level or at a pragmatical level, without first thinking about the philosophical sources of the problem. So I think that the last lecture is precisely, dedicated to offering solutions to what the continent can do and what we can do as the African continent. But what are we doing to what? So the what that needs to be resolved must be properly understood. We've just seen that colonialism that we assumed was something we understood. All of a sudden, our understanding of it, has shifted. So we must first understand the problem in order to be able to proffer a solution. We would spend a lot of time, talking about the solution in the last lecture. The second question you raised about the agency. Agency. In the academic discourse, trying to find a briefer way of putting it. See, in the academic discourse, agency has often been pitted against structure. So structuralism says, no, structure is more determinant, or the material conditions are more determinant. And then post-colonial scholars say, no, people have agency under whatever conditions. And then we have often assumed that these two, are two polar opposites because, of course, they've come to us as academic fashions, one after the other. And we think that the world, exists in that way. Agency exists even when you do wrong things. It is agency, or even when structure leads you the wrong way, it is agency that is still. So when African countries decide, that they are going to, for instance, post-independence, continue to produce what we do not consume and, consume what we do not produce. That's agency. But it is conditioned by material conditions. So I think there is a much better way of thinking about the interaction between agency and the objective material conditions and structure, rather than thinking that you have agency to just decide to go against the grain. There were a number of African leaders that tried. Nyerere tried to go against the grain. Where did it end up? It ended up in the same failure with those who actually went along, because structure constrained that agency into a certain outcome. So if I'm not answering your question, the point I'm trying to make is that let us think about agency and structure or constraint. Maybe you're not even think about structure or constraint and agency. Those two things exist, not as separate, you may have agency that is constrained by conditions and is constrained into a wrong outcome. It's still agency. It doesn't mean that agency always leads to the right outcome. That's the point I'm trying to. I think she was first.
I'm actually gonna shelve my question for the next meeting because it has a lot to do with what you just asked in terms of the pessimism of colonialism. But I feel like that's what you're gonna talk about in your subsequent lecture. So maybe I'll ask my question then.
Okay. There's the director.
Okay.
That's
one or two more, then maybe you can ask all questions. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. You made a comment about the colonizers' indirect rule. And I'm curious, were our forefathers having a system of governance? And how did the indirect rule change that?
okay. That's a fairly straightforward. So there are two texts that help me think about that. There is a text by a Nigerian scholar called Ife Amadiome. Ife Amadiome wrote a book titled Female Husbands, Male Daughters. Yeah. Female husbands, male daughters. What was she trying to do in the text? So she's Igbo and she's writing about the society. She's trying to say that, you see, the Western binary categorization of male and female actually did not exist as it exists today with the assignation of roles on the basis of gender. That is why she's playing in the title female husbands and male husbands. Because she says in the Igbo society, what is today, in today's understanding of gender roles, was actually performed by females. What is today performed by males was performed by females. But the point that answers your question in Ife Amadiome's book is that in Igbo society, there were different sections of what is called the Igbo society today. In some sections, basically, there was something called age guilds that governed society. So people were under the authority of their age guild. It was not always chieftains. He says there were different kinds of, configurations of authority. At some point, you were under, your age guild, you graduated into, something else. It was not always the chief. In fact, amongst the Igbos, as she shows, the concept of the chief was foreign because, it only comes with colonialists. And in fact, Igbo society is an example in her book of where indirect rule actually created chiefs where they had previously not existed.
We'll take one more. In the meantime, feel free to grab from the group, but we'll take the last one.
I would just like to say, firstly, you're a brilliant speaker, and I really like how you directed us through your train of thought, referring to things in the past. You talk about the parallels between colonization and the Industrial Revolution as epochal movements, and you describe them as tidal waves and totalizing. totalizing. And so like when I think of that, I would like I see a lot of I see like a need to like restructure like mentality or the way we think, especially like in the West, to like kind of create solutions to that. Like, how do you see like the West as like a part or a part of the solution,
Can never be.
not a part of it?
It can't, because as you can see, at least so far, we'll disagree with this paradigm as we go along, but working on what we have already, we can see that there is an asymmetrical relationship, an unequal relationship between the West and Africa. And that unequal relationship is to the benefit of the West. In fact, you know, the West is the West because of that asymmetrical relationship. A better way of thinking about it, you know, Fanon says, we are white because we are rich, and we are rich because we are white. Which is to say, we are the West because of Africa's impoverization, and it cannot be otherwise. So for as long as the West is the West, which includes the fact that it has a certain identity, a form of life, and a cultural expression, which is founded on its superiority over the non-West. See, the category West springs into existence another category, non-West. You are an undergrad student, isn't it? How would you feel if your lecturer always came to class and said, you know, good morning or good afternoon to all of you non-postgrad students? Because his or she's defining you by what you are not, isn't it? But also he or she is assuming that that's the aspiration you want. Now, when you define people as the non-West, you are doing exactly the same thing. We are putting them in a category of what they are not. We are supposing that that's what they want. Being West is the ultimate category because they are the non-West. It's what is called a category of negation. I basically negate your identity. You're an undergrad student. There's nothing wrong with that. I must consider you as an undergrad student. But when I then consider you by what we are not, it's a negation. I'm negating what you are. So the West, its existence itself it leads logically to the negation of what are called non-Western people. And so it can't be, you know, a part of the solution. But it's more than that. It is just that if you were a materialist, you would then see that the economic interests of the West are basically tied to the exploitation of the non-West. One example so that she can get a point. So there's today a concern in the world about the environment. Now, you may have heard about all the good initiatives that are happening in the world in order to address the environment. Let me tell you one of them. In fact, the core of them, it is that any country can go to another country and pay that country to be more environmentally friendly and then claim credit whilst it continues with its own, you know, environmentally unfriendly practices. So America is not going to change its dependence on fossil fuel. It's not going to change anything in the way it does things. What is it going to do? It's going to go to South Africa as it has done and say to South Africa, we will give you money so that you can increase your wetlands, your preserved wetlands. So we've now doubled a preserved wetland, and America claims credit in the international environmental economy that is being created as being environmentally progressive. And we incur the burden because now, you know, we've increased a preserved wetland, people can't fish there anymore, and all of those things. So you transfer the contradictions into the non-Western world. So the identity of the West is basically dependent on the exploitation of the non-Western world. That's why I'm saying it can't be part of the solution.
One last question.
I think my question was sort of asked before this, but when we describe colonization as a epoch event that has this totalizing effect. It's sort of how much do we understand about communities before colonization, and what sort of counterfactuals can we have in our minds about how differently things would have turned out, even though, as you said, that might be difficult to do without colonization? What aspects of society before this big epoch? How much do we understand about that?
No, certainly the fact that colonialism is totalizing doesn't mean we can't understand them. We can study. We can study those societies. There are many ways of studying them. Languages tell us, there is archaeological work, there is anthropological work that is able to go behind colonialism. Here is the point. It is that whatever else you find having existed prior to colonialism, don't then transpose it into the post-colonial era. It doesn't exist as it had existed. But African societies, we can study them as far back as we wish, as far back as we want, and as far back as the tools and the evidence provides. Not just hard evidence. We can do a linguistic analysis. We can do all kinds of analysis. But the point AK is making is that don't then transpose those things you would have found to have existed and say they still exist. Colonialism transforms everything. That's why I tried to give the example of the artifacts, the artworks. They have a long history, centuries prior to colonialism. But once colonialism came, their meaning changed altogether.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lushaba. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming. There's lots of actually part 2 of the second part of the series, the other Friday, so 2 weeks from now. So please join us as we continue with the conversation that we started. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it will be here. Well, I'm not sure whether it would be here, but it would be in person.
How long are you in?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I suspect I'll be teaching in politics. I think I'll be offering a course in politics.
Maybe this break.
Yeah.
Yes, so we absolutely.
All right, really?
Otherwise, it's good. I didn't see those.
I went through and just